All right. I'm glad to be here in Kyiv. It's been amazing to hear the level of the talks that have been here today. It's been great. It's been truly great to hear the technical details that's been presented here. I heard one talk about architecture in iOS apps, or apps in general, which was truly great. And now the previous talk here was about data in your apps, and how apps is just a pretty version of JSON. And most of these talks have been about the how to technically make an app, which is good, by all means. It's good that we have talks about that. But what I want to talk about is the softer side of it. How do we actually make good apps for people to use? How do we get our clients, our project managers, project team, product people, how do you get them on board and to make really excellent apps? And so, I work as a senior advisor and project manager, and I worked with one particular project that is used in 24 countries and translated to 28 different languages. The last deployment was in India and Australia for a company that has about 117,000 employees. And with big companies, you often get strict details on how to get to the goal, to the end goal, how to build this. So you get a list of requirements and specifications that are there for you to tick off as you go through them. Which, I mean, it can be good if you want to make just that one thing, and if you're absolutely sure that that's what you're going to make. But what I want to talk about is doing it in a different way, in a way that I think reduces friction. How we can all be part of changing how companies and clients work with apps. And so, these guys, NASA, in the late 60s, or mid-60s, late 60s, they thought, we don't know enough about the universe. There's so much out there that we know nothing about. We want to explore more of it. So, what NASA did was that they sent out this rocket. It's a Saturn rocket. And it is one of the most successful missions in the history of the organization. On board this rocket was a small satellite or probe called the Voyager was on board. This is Voyager. And this was back in September of 1977. So it's more than 40 years ago. 40 years ago. Launched it right into space. Voyager zooms out into the universe. It passes Jupiter. And it goes past Saturn. And it even shoots past one of the moons. Like that one right there, which is called Titan. And it's so incredibly far out into space. This is the furthest in space anyone has ever been. Or at least something that we've made. And NASA launched this. And after 40 years in space, this little device is starting to fall apart. Bit by bit, it stops working. Its solar panels are no longer working as it should. it's not enough energy on board to steer it to the correct path, and it is slowly fading away from us. It's slowly dying, more or less. And then someone has a bright idea. Because back in the 70s, they made 2 of everything on board this. And you think, we have a backup system. A backup system that we've never used, because it's a backup system. What happens if we try to fire the backup rockets for steering this? No one knew. Luckily, this was written, or the code on board Voyager is written in C, so they were able to dig through and find the bits that they needed, and they tried. They launched a command to Voyager to have it fire its backup steering rockets, just ever so slightly, for bursts of, I think it's 10 milliseconds, to steer it to a different path, so that it'll absorb more energy and live a little bit longer. And they send a signal from NASA, and it takes 19 hours and 35 minutes to go from Earth up to Voyager, and then it takes another 19 hours back. The signal from Voyager starts out at something at 28 watts, which is the same amount of energy as the light bulb in your refrigerator. It's not much. And because this device is so far into space, when it reaches planet Earth, it is reduced to 1/1,000,000th of 1/1,000,000th watts. They need a satellite dish that is 70 meters in diameter to receive those signals. They wait anxiously, and lo and behold, it worked. They have been able to fire rockets on board Voyager that prolonged its life for a year, maybe 2, using software that was developed 40 years ago. 40 years ago. For most of us don't make stuff for NASA. And most of us won't make software that lasts for 40 years. I'm pretty sure that, or when I look at the code that I wrote 10 years ago, I'm ashamed and embarrassed, let alone 40 years ago, or 40 years. So we don't make, or most of us don't make software for NASA. Most of us don't have those kind of strict restrictions and requirements and specifications when we're making apps. Which means that we have a bit more leniency. We can be a bit more adventurous when we're making apps. And when I started as a project manager, I had a project that was start out with a clear specification. This is what we're going to make. It was for a phone company, and it said you have to do this, that, and the other. They provided this list. The list looks something like this. Here are your requirements. Make this. And by the way, you have this amount of money, and it must be done in 6 months. Go nuts. And when you have a list like this, one way to approach is just tick everything off as you go through them and say, check, we've done that, check, we've done that, and go through it functionality by functionality. It's okay. We took this list and we went to our design team. The designers, along with the developers, came up with a concept for this app, which answered most of the things, but not everything. And it also answered some of the things that the client asked about in a meeting that we had, which were like additional stuff. So it's a pretty long list. And lo and behold, it didn't work. We were 6 months delayed, and absolutely nothing worked when we were about to be done. We started this project because we had an API we had to integrate with. API is data. Data is beautiful, as we just heard. And JSON is like, JSON. But this API was SOAP. SOAP is XML. And this particular API came with 80 pages of documentation. And not a single page of that documentation said anything on how to actually use the API or what you could expect in return. And so we hacked away at this API and tried to make it work. And the specs list that we had, after a while, we discovered that there were quite a few other things on the specifications that were not possible to do with the API. It didn't exist in the API. There was no way of achieving it. And so we had to make hacks. So that if you did this, we would fire an email instead to customer service, and they would handle it manually in the background, which is not the way to go about it. Just don't do that. One of the things we discovered when we were doing this was that the customer service people, they were complaining every so often about the API being slow, that the system that they were using was a bit slow. And no one has really ever paid attention to it. So we fired up this app, made it work, and discovered that the API was slow. One endpoint gave us back 1 megabyte of data in XML to the app. And it took between 10 to 12 seconds to respond. And no one had cared about fixing it within the organization. There's not a single user out there, and not in this room and not out in the wild either, that will wait 10 to 12 seconds for an API to respond. No one. But what we've done with this project previously, right after we'd started it, was that one of our developers set up a build pipeline. So he connected the GitHub account, where you have all the code, up to a build system called Bitrise, and then Hockey for distributing it. And we gave the app, we installed it on all the phones to the management team of this phone company. And the management team had heard about this API being slow and whatever. But all of a sudden, they could feel it. Because all of a sudden, they had to use 10 to 12 seconds to see their data in a subscription app. And that changed everything. Because when you talk about this in abstract terms with your clients or your project managers and product owners, they're not fully able to wrap their heads around what you're really talking about. When you have it in your hand, when you can see it yourself with your user, when you log in and you can see, all of a sudden it makes sense. All of a sudden the management team could see, oh, 10 seconds, 12 seconds, yes. That's a long time. So we ended up with a build pipeline like this, as I mentioned, and it worked. It was just brilliant to see the response of the management team and how we were not the bad guys anymore. All of a sudden, they could see what we were doing almost on a daily basis. Whenever we pushed code to Git, a new build was triggered. which meant that they could see and feel all the improvements that we made with the app. They could also see that the 10 seconds delay had nothing to do with us. But it made it more tangible. They could feel it. And it's difficult to understate how important it is to make something touchable, tangible, put it in the hands of those who actually decide. So, after I finished this project, the app launched and everyone was moderately happy, I started my next project. And I knew one thing. I would not start with a specification and requirements list ever again. There was absolutely no way I would take on a project as a project manager with a list of requirements that I hadn't made. No way. But I also knew that I wanted to do this. Having continuous integration and deployment, key. And so, I'd also started my previous project, this phone app, with the wrong assumption. The assumption that projects are IT projects. But when you're making an app, you're making something for someone. Your code is virtually worthless when it's just code. Everything that you have in Xcode or Android Studio, everything that's committed to Git is useless if it's not in the hands of a user. Because that's what they're paying you for. Writing code? Nah. Making something. It's building a product. That's where the value comes in. And apps and software are about helping people. Helping people achieve their goals. Helping companies achieve their goals. If it's an internal app, if it's an external app for end users, but it's still about helping someone, getting something done. There's not a single app on your phone that doesn't have a purpose. And the purpose is usually, lists or requirements are usually purpose or things that come from inside the organization. And they're usually about keeping your back clear when everything goes haywire and making sure that everyone is heard. But apps and software are about helping people. So let's do that. Another thing with apps is that they're about focus. Clear, concise focus. If you look at the size of your phone, it's actually quite small compared to the 24-inch monitor that you have connected to your laptop or computer at home or whatever. So you've got a pretty small amount of real estate for you to fill, or for the company to fill, for the client to fill, or for product manager to fill. And that means that they need to know precisely what to put there. So you don't want to put anything in an app that's not absolutely necessary. You want to have focus, distilling down what this company is really about. What is this project about? What are we trying to achieve? And that conversation with your client or with your team is gold. Just finding out, take this list of requirements and saying, yeah, I see you got a list of requirements, but what are you really trying to achieve? What are you got this one opportunity to talk to your clients and people, customers, end user, whatever. What is it that you want to convey? Do you want to tick off a list of requirements, or do you want to make the end user happy? And when you do that, you boil down like to the core and to the essence of what the company is about and what they are trying to achieve for the clients or for the end users. And so this project that I started next, we started out with 3 things. Sat down with our client and said, okay, what is it really that you're trying to achieve? Why are we doing this? And the what, like 3 simple questions. So, and the what, like what are we trying to achieve? What is the end goal here? Are we trying to make an internal task easier to do? Or are we trying to help our users check their balance, manage their exercises, keeping track of their fitness, whatever? What are we trying to achieve? And usually what you're trying to achieve is never described in a list of requirements. A list of requirements is just a list, and it's usually not even prioritized. When you have the answer to the what, you know precisely what you're trying to do. Then you can start on, why are we doing this? And that's especially when you're working with companies that are not entirely sure what they're doing. They just need an app for some reason. They just see that everyone else, the competition, have an app, and they want an app as well. Like, yeah, but why? If it's just to blow away a lot of money, cool, let's do that. But as long as you're aware of that. But if that why is about, or when you're talking about the why, and you talk about, are we doing this to manage a task or making a task easier? Are we trying to do this to offload tasks from our customer service? Are we trying to do this to empower our user? Or are we just simply trying to do it to make money? If it's a frivolous, or if the why is bad, if there's not enough value in the why, don't do it. Just drop the project because it's not worth doing. If you don't know why you're doing it, then it's probably not worth doing. And it's when we've gone through these 3, or the 2 first one, we can start talking about, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to find out how to succinctly answer the first 2? How are we going to talk to our clients? How are we going to do user testing? How are we going to develop it? How are we going to actually build this? And what happens then is that your client or customer get ownership to what you're trying to achieve. The team gets ownership. Everyone knows what we're doing. There's no ambiguity in what you're doing if your goal is to track exercises. You know exactly where you're heading. But if you have a list of requirements that says enter calories, track calories, like enter food, edit food, and all that, you have no purpose. You don't see where you're heading. Because you have a list of short-term tasks that you're going to go through. Whereas when you have 3 questions like these that sets your direction, you know where you're heading. And if there's one thing that's absolutely true, it's that direction beats speed every time. It doesn't matter if you have a team of 10 developers, 15, or 2, if they're all heading in the wrong direction with your product or with the app. If you're developing something which is going in the absolute wrong direction of what you want to achieve, it doesn't matter how fast you're going through that list of requirements, how fast you're pushing out things in Git or how fast you're closing tasks in Jira. None of that matters if you're going in the wrong direction. So having the entire team and the project owner and your product owner on board with the direction, that's absolute key. And one of the ways you can achieve or make sure that you're going in the right direction is by having continuous integration and deployment, showing where you're heading every day. Because when your client can see for themselves, they can open their app, they get a notification that says, here's a new update, and they can see, okay, now this works. They know if you're heading in the right direction or not. And you can make adjustments accordingly. Because it's far cheaper to fix things early in a project than to fix it late. And a key requirement here is to have involvement. You have to get everyone aboard. So a product owner or a client that's closely involved in your project that wants to achieve the same thing as you do is key. So that they can come with the feedback you need as early and as often as you need. I usually try to avoid meetings in my projects. And I usually try to avoid emails as well. But I want our client to be as closely involved with what we're doing as possible. And one of the ways I try to achieve that is by using Slack. So this is the Slack channel that we use internally. It is a complete and entirely transparent list of everything we're doing. So whenever we push a new version of the app, or a new version is built, it appears here. And our client is in here as well. There's nothing going on in this channel that our client doesn't see. Nothing happens with the app without our client being involved. So when we get stupid things like this, where the app has crashed, they see it. We see it. We all know it's happening. And that level of transparency means that they know what to prioritize next. And that they can have a conversation with us on what are we trying to do now that will fix this. Because this is a production app. This app is in use all over Europe. And now in India and next to Australia. It needs to work. It's absolutely crucial that this app works. And they can see whenever it doesn't work, whenever it crashes. And they can ask us, like, what's going on now? Why is this build not as stable as the previous one? And we can say, it's because, okay, we'll look into it. And we can have that dialogue instantly. No emails, no meetings. And the same goes for when we're doing entirely new stuff. They can open the app and they can see, I'm not sure if this is the right approach or the right direction. They can open their app and say, maybe we want to take picture as the key functionality and not as the second functionality. Maybe we should move that into focus. And we can iterate over our ideas together. Because they are usually closest to the end user. And we have experience in making apps and making great design and user experiences. Those things need to come together. And one of the ways, again, is by having the product, the thing you're trying to make, and putting it in the hands of the people who are actually paying for it, so that they can follow it. And the benefit here is that this reduces friction. I don't have to have meetings with our client where they are unhappy about where we are with our app, and or that the app is unstable. I don't have to have that conversation in a meeting, because they've seen it. They know it's not stable, or they know we've fixed it. They know what the problem is and what's not. And in most cases, it's the client who's the first to know when something's wrong, because they are closest to the users. They are the one with the call centers and with the customer service, and they are the ones who get the feedback first. And when you have error reporting like that, and that level of transparency, you get to be all that closer to that conversation. To say to your client or customer, it's like, we know that your customer services know. We know that this is a problem, and we're working on fixing it. This, by the way, is an attempt to actually write continuous, which is absolutely horrible word. Absolute. I understand why they just shorten it with CI/CD. Jeez. Anyway, for the longer term tasks, we use a Trello board. Again, we invite our client in, they have full access, they see everything that we do, they shuffle about the cards and do whatever they want with them. And then we have two backlogs. We have one column for the more technical stuff that we have added. So you got one backlog of technical things that we want to fix, that are purely like keeping up technical debt, writing more tests, whatever we need to do to keep the app stable. And then you have their backlog, which is a column of things they want to fix, such as moving things around, adding different fields in the app, making it do different stuff. And then we have a conversation in Slack on how to prioritize between the two. We are free to do as much of things as we see fit, as long as they know about it. We can prioritize more or less everything in there, as long as they know about it and don't disagree. And that level of trust and confidence comes from transparency and them knowing what we're doing and seeing that it actually works. Good. If we hadn't shown them that this approach works, I'm not sure we would have been here. And having the new and improved version of the project, we ended up with a new pipeline that we use PoEditor for translation and localization. You got GitHub that pulls everything together, which builds this thing via Bitrise. You got Trello for all the cards and the card sorting that we do. And Hockey are now Visual Studio for Teams, or what it's called, for distributing it, and then communication via Slack. And there's no straight line between these. It's not like we start with one and then go through. You don't start in top right and move on bottom left. These are interconnected in almost every way possible. Because as soon as we've released a new build, we add a tag of that build. We bump the version number in iOS. We create a tag in GitHub. When we're building, we fetch the latest JSON files, language files from PoEditor, and all of that is built straight into and distributed via hockey, and then published. And information is posted on Slack, so everyone knows. If it fails, if Bitrise can't build, if a test is not green, straight to Slack. We get a message that says, this didn't work, try again. And they can see it. Our client can follow whatever we're doing and see that. And it goes, Donald Rumsfeld said it so eloquently. And it's the same with the Voyager team. They knew what they knew, and they knew what they didn't know. But you can't know what you don't know. And planning for all the things that you don't know, is virtually impossible. So having a list of specifications and requirements for all the things that you don't know, that's not going to work. And these guys, the Voyager team, they knew that. That's why they built 2 of everything. They did it 40 years ago. But they also had the advantage of having a huge amount of cash to spend on the software. They also had an incredibly smart client. NASA is probably the best and the brightest in their field. They knew exactly what they wanted. But the Voyager doesn't have to think about GDPR. It doesn't have to think about the new brand guidelines or whatever marketing stunt the marketing division is doing. Voyager lives in a vacuum. It doesn't care about anything else other than itself. Our projects don't. But because we knew when we were doing or dealing with software, because we know the what and the why, it's easier to tackle those insecurities when you get along. It's easier to know where you want to go next when you have a good understanding of what you're doing. So then it doesn't matter when you reach something that you don't know about. And then when you're dealing with new stuff and you talking to your client and say, we want a cup of coffee. I was like, yes, here you go, cup of coffee. Was that what you wanted? And the client says, I was thinking more along the lines of, how do you describe things? How do you talk about things? What words do you use to describe whatever it is that you're trying to do? If that list only exists in writing, written 6 months ago or a year ago, you have no idea what they actually meant. Maybe they wanted it in a takeaway cup. And this goes for software as well. When you're close with your client and you're releasing often and they can see it, they can comment on small things when you go along. And that's important. And then it's also important to note that this approach has its limitations, because one size fits none. It's not like you can just take this approach and say, this project we're going to follow, everything is going to be transparent, we're going to have this pipeline, and we're going to use Trello, and everything is going to be in there, we're going to talk to our client in Slack, make stuff work. Because every project is different, every client is different, and all the other vendors that you're dependent on is different. And also, most projects live on a scale. You got porting of existing solutions, for instance, and then you got innovation and bleeding edge. If you're making an iOS version of a web page, maybe, or an existing Windows app, for instance, and you're trying to appificate that, starting to question everything in your specifications is maybe not the best approach, because then you know exactly what you're trying to do. and what it should be, what the business logic is and all that. So if you're on this end of the spectrum, yeah, I wouldn't recommend this. But if you're on trying to do something new, trying to innovate, going where no one's gone before, kind of like Voyager, I would sincerely recommend having your client involved and deliver value to them as often as possible. And there are three things, right? Three key takeaways. Then the transparency that I've talked so much about. It's also keeping your client involved. Letting them know what you're doing. Let them be invested in what you're doing. They are actually paying for it, so they should be. And then it's frequent and meaningful releases. When you do that, you have a pretty good success, or a pretty good chance of success, and you don't have to have a list of requirements and specifications to do that. And then there's one small caveat here. Do please write release notes. Because when you publish an app to your client and it says new version and then build number, they don't know what you've done, necessarily. So remember release notes in your build system as well. Just 2 lines of text letting them know this is what we changed. And that is my recommendation for projects and how to do frictionless projects with continuous integration and deployment, and how to keep your customers happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think so that Håvard is ready to answer the question if you have. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I have couple of questions about your experience. You offered us to ask a client 3 questions.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how many projects you had before you come to these questions, And another question, you showed us a lot of instruments for continuous integration and development, distribution. Are you using them now, or these were just for example? Are you stop on using just them, or you are planning to maybe use some others in the future? Thank you.
Okay, to tackle your last question first. We will use whatever tool we think does the job best. So if we see that a different tool or another tool will help us do the job better, we'll implement that. I'm not religious about the tool chain that we're using. I'm more than happy to set fire to the entire tool chain and then go a different way, if that's better. If that creates value for our customer and our client, fine, we'll do it. So use the tools that create the least amount of friction possible. I particularly like Bitrise as a build or CI tool. Because Bitrise, it's not expensive as such. It's free if your build time is less than 10 minutes for iOS and Android apps. But you can't have concurrent builds. So if you're a team with lots of apps, you have to go for a pro version, and the pro version is $540 or something per year. But Bitrise allows you to write your own steps in your build tool chain. Like the step where we are we're incrementing the build number by 1, as you should, because that makes everything easier when you're debugging. And then we're pushing that as a tag to GitHub as well, so that you can see exactly what was included in that build. That is a step that we have written ourselves. And getting release notes in is also something that we've just simple step that we've built ourselves. So using Bitrise was just the easiest way to get started, and it just works. I love it. They provide good customer support as well. And then your first question about how long it took us to get to this stage and to the point of actually being able to ask these questions with our clients. The short answer is that it depends. Because you have some clients who are not used to doing agile software development projects. You have some clients who are used to developing in the dark for a year and a half, 2 years, spending insane amounts of money on the project, and then, boom, releasing it. Like classic waterfall projects where everything is in one big go at the end, and you just pray that it works. Some clients are like that, and they want everything to be like that so that they can have acceptance tests where they can tick off all their boxes and say, yes, this works. The only thing they've forgotten about is that in the year it took, or year and a half that it took to write that solution and build that solution and test it, your end users has moved to an entirely different place. I once heard this great quote from my boss. A client of ours was having this huge IT project. We're spending loads of money on it. And they put all other development on hold because they wanted to build this platform first. They just needed everything in the background to be perfect. So they had their ERP systems and the CRM systems, SAP and whatever. They just needed that stack, that platform to be complete before they could do anything else. My boss, at the end of this meeting, got a bit impatient with the client and said, you know, when the train leaves the station, you know what's the only thing left when the train leaves? It's the platform. So quit building platforms. Platforms is just obsolete. And having that conversation with your clients about what do you want to do can reveal where they are on a scale of being digitally mature. Do they want to have one big release at the end of 6 months? Do they want to... where are they? Are they at a stage where you can actually probe them on these questions? And that'll be... when you're working with a client over time, you can help them mature. You can help them become more agile, if you like. I hope that was an answer to your question. There's one at the back. Here's the... all right. There was one here first, sorry.
So you showed how you post everything in Slack for your client to see. So they see crash reports and they see when your build actually.
Yeah.
And so I see a couple of risks there, and I would like to know how you deal with this. Like the first is that there is too much information, and like it soon becomes noise to which the client doesn't pay attention anymore because he says, oh, it's just another crash report. Oh, it's another build that doesn't go. I don't care. So they stop looking at that. On the other side, I see the risk that they start paying attention to stuff that is not very relevant. And I've seen this with some clients. For example, they see some crash reports. Let's say they see like 20 crash reports. It's like, oh, these look like many crash reports. But then you have a user base of like millions of users, so it's negligible. But they get focused on the crash reports, and to them it looks really important, while actually you have other priorities. So like, how do you deal with these two cases?
We deal with them in two ways. One is that we take every, and I mean every crash report, seriously. If there's a crash, if someone has experienced a crash, we want to know why. And we try to fix it, either by actually fixing the problem if we can find it, or making sure that we can catch that error, and that it's not a fatal crash. The second thing you can do, if you have millions and millions of users, and especially on Android, where you can have old versions of your SDK floating about, and old versions or old phones and all that. It's less of a problem on iOS, I admit. But if you're on Android, it might be a bigger problem. What you can do then is you can set thresholds for when a bug should be reported. So for a different project that we have, where you have we have an app that 1/5 of the Norwegian population has installed. For that app, you set thresholds on percentage crash within a limit of time. But you can also say that if you're doing scaled deployments of your app instead, saying that like you can do now on Android and Google Play, you can release an app to 5% of the users and see where does that take you. Will the 5% with this app, will they receive crashes? Okay, it didn't crash for this many users, and Google Play can do this quite good for you. So you can scale your deployment accordingly to make sure that you're catching whatever might appear, and also then set thresholds for when it should be reported. But I would urge to set that threshold low to keep you developers on your toes. But that's, I mean, I'm a project manager, I don't write any code, so it's easy for me to say. There's a question at the back as well.
I have almost the same question as the previous one, but for the part of this question you already answered. And another one, like when your customers see crash reports, yes, and I think most of them start to panic, or okay, they start to panic. And what do they do? Do they trigger you every time, and then you trigger your development team, or do they trigger developers like directly? And it interrupts like main job if they don't know that these crashes are not that important and they don't need to pay attention to it.
Okay. Most of the time, our client is not, I won't say that they don't care, but most of the time they just see a crash report and it's like, okay, it crashed. It happens. And the way you get there, where you have a client who says, yeah, crashes happen, but let's try to fix it, is by having a good conversation with them about what it means to make software. You will never have an app that is 100% crash-free. It won't happen. It's utopia. So you need to have a good conversation with your client saying, there are some crashes, they will happen, there are bugs in the code, it happens. We will try to limit them as best we can and make sure that we have as few of them as possible. The few cases we have when they see a crash and they report it to us, or like they ping us on Slack, is when they are actively testing themselves and they can see, my app crashed and it's reported here on Slack. Then they can ping me or some of the developers and say, okay, this is what happened. And since they have ownership to the app and the developers are seeing it, they can just figure out, is this important to fix and is it not? And that's particularly true when it comes to third-party libraries or crashes that happen right after we've done something massive. Then we can say to our client, before we push our code to Git and a new version comes out, we can say, we might have some issues now. We are on it if they appear. Just relax. So it's all about communicating with your client, saying that this is to be expected on some level. And most of the time, your client have a day job as well. They have a job that they're tending to, so they're in meetings at their company. They're having lunch, they're working on the tasks that they have to do. So they don't sit and surveillance this every single minute and every single hour of the day. But they can see it. They can scroll up and down and say, okay, it happened. Well, what are we doing with this? So they can have an informed conversation with us afterwards. So this is meant as a tool for both us and them to have good and constructive discussions on where we need to put our priorities. If we see that one library is crashing, one set of code is crashing often, we know we have to put X amount of hours into fixing that particular thing, even if that requires us to refactor a whole lot of code. But it means that you can have a good conversation about it. And that is gold. I hope I answered your question. So, as I said earlier, it depends on how you want to do it. All right, cheers.